Well, Garland Nixon here, and the leaders of NATO and the European nations seem to be consistently making some really boneheaded, counterproductive moves. Let's talk about why. Hello, Garland here, and we're going to have a nice, philosophical discussion tonight. You can tell I'm tired. I had a long day. I did my radio shows and just all kinds of stuff going on today, so I've been busy. Got a good workout this evening, and I'm tired, ready to crash. So, when you see people making foolish decisions, right? You see people doing things that are really boneheaded. I don't want to see my face in the Rockfin window because that'll screw me all up. You got to ask yourself why. What is the reasoning behind it? It doesn't make sense. But you know how I feel. If I say something's illogical, if it happened, it had to be logical. It wouldn't have happened. You just don't understand the logic, right? I got stuff all over my glasses here. Forgive me. So the question is, why? What the hell's going on here, right? Well, there are a number of things. Even the U.S., they're doing this. They're making these absurd thoughts and statements about what the Russians think, what the Russians want, what the Russians believe, what the Russians are trying to do. Let me start here. You're talking to idiots when they say things like that. You're talking to people who are not living in the world of reality because, just from an epistemological perspective, right? How do we know what we know? Here's the issue, and you might have heard me say this before. You never know another person's reasoning. You never know another person's. There's a book by Malcolm Gladwell, who is a guy who, said a lot of bonehead things. I don't have a lot of respect for him in a lot of ways, but he's not an idiot, and he's written a couple good books, and I've read a number of them. One of them was called Blink. And in that book, one of the things that he talks about, I think it's called the lockbox, right? And let me sum it up. Sometimes when we do things, we don't know why we did it, right? If someone was to say, why'd you do that? The truth is, you may come up with an answer, but you don't really know the answer. Somebody says, why'd you do that, Garland? Why'd you say that? Well, the answer may be something in your past that happened. You were mistreated by your father at the age of 5. You had your bicycle stolen at 12, and you've been scarred. Things that happened when you were 18 months old that you don't even know about. These things are having a psychological effect on you that you are not aware of it. They're part of the operating system. They're part of the BIOS, right? You don't know why you're doing this. And then you do something and it seems stupid. And somebody says, why'd you do that? And you're like, and you give them a reason and they believe it and you believe it, but it ain't the real reason because you don't know the real reason because it's operating below the level of consciousness. It's something in there, some fear, some anxiety, some anger, something that you have below the level of consciousness. And someone says, why'd you do it? You don't know why you did it. So you try to come up with a reason. And it sounds good to you and it sounds good to the other people, but that ain't the reason. Why do I say that? Because when you try to say this person did this for that reason, this is what they want, this is what they're trying to accomplish, this is what their goal is, right? The truth is, the only way you could know that would be by asking that person. And even then you might not get the correct answer. They may just lie to you. Why'd you do that? Because I wasn't feeling good that day. It was a lie. They did it for a totally different reason that they don't want you to know. B, they may give you a reason that they believe. Well, I did it because you stepped on my foot. Little do they know they did it because their father stepped on their foot when they were 3, and they're angry that anybody that steps on their foot. See what I'm getting at? You may not know why you did things. We don't always know why we do things, and we sure as hell don't know why other people do things, right? But when you're making decisions, you got to base them on something. So here's where I'm going. If you're basing your decisions, if you way back when I was first started taking computer courses and learning about computer, I remember the SISO. Remember that? shit in, shit out. You get bad information in, you're going to get bad. You set up a database, you set up some things, you put bad information in, you're going to get bad information out of it, right? The same thing with your decisions. If your decisions are based on wrong head, let me give you an example. So I do a show on KPFK, right, in 90.7 in Los Angeles. Every week I do my show. Well, I was on Mondays, and after me was some idiot named Brad Friedman. And a little Brad Friedman would come. This is what Brad, I'd say what I say. Doesn't matter where I am. It doesn't matter. I'm on the phone with friends. I'm on the radio. I'm on YouTube. It don't matter. If you ask me a question, I'm going to give you an answer. But Brad Friedman isn't bright enough to figure that out. And it doesn't work for his crazy land, neoliberal bullshit thought, whatever it is, right? So I'd go say all the things I believe on, and Brad would come on and say he did that because he works for Putin and he's a Putin Russian puppet and the money. Garland doesn't believe any of that stuff that he's saying. He's just saying it for the money. And I thought to myself, well, wouldn't you have to do a little research before you did that, Brad? Wouldn't you have to know whether or not Garland was wealthy enough that he needed the money? What if you find out that Garland's got so much money that he doesn't need it? What if you find out that Garland has sworn to poverty? He's taken an oath of poverty, and Garland's a billionaire. Well, he sure as hell didn't say that for the money because he doesn't need it. B, Garland is a Zen monk and he's taken an oath of poverty. Well, he sure as hell didn't do it for the money because any money that comes in, he gives it to the poor. So before you say Garland did it for the money, you got to do some research, don't you? You got to figure that out. Could there be a circumstance where Garland either doesn't need the money or doesn't want the money? But Brad Friedman, being a pile of crap that he is, wasn't bright enough to stop and think through. He just did what any person who was a puppet mind of the government would do, and he used the talking points that they do. Oh, he's using Putin talking points. So if Putin says it's raining and I look outside and it's raining, I guess I shouldn't say it's raining because that would be a Putin talking point. I've got to say something totally false. I got to look outside and see water coming down and say, well, I'd like to say it's raining, but Putin said it's raining. And I can't very well use Putin talking points, even though they're right. Right. So that's the mentality of some of these people. As I have said before, we have an epistemological crisis in the United States where people don't stop to think when they say something. If I believe something, how do I know that? Why do I believe that? If I am pressed on it, if someone says, how do you know that I can give them a sound answer based on empirical evidence, based on data, at least based on some reasonable judgment, not just, yeah, he said that because he's a Putin puppet, right? So what am I getting at here? If you think Garland's saying things because he's a Putin puppet, you're going to go forward with things that are wrong. From then on, you started off with bad information. All your deductions are going to be bad. Okay. And I know somebody's going to say to Brad Friedman, Garland's calling you an idiot. If you're not an idiot, then you wouldn't be saying idiotic things. But at any rate, I mean, here's a guy. Let me just say this before I go on. You say, why? Well, Garland, you're calling Brad Friedman an idiot. You're not the kind of people that call a person an idiot. Why Brad Friedman? The guy says Garland Nixon has a show on Radio Sputnik, therefore we can't trust him. Although Garland Nixon's been on Pacifica 10 years before we even heard of Radio Sputnik. I was on Pacifica and I'm still on Pacifica. And might I add, if you want, let me show you something. I hate to get too caught up with Brad Friedman, but since I've already called him an idiot, I guess I better do what I say I like to do. And that was this. So here's the guy who said Garland Nixon is a Russian bot and can't believe anything that he says because he has a show on Radio Sputnik. Let's look at this. Brad Friedman. Hey, there's Brad Friedman shows on Radio Sputnik. This guy had a show on Radio Sputnik for years before I even heard of Radio Sputnik. But for some reason, And now listen to this. And now he has a show on Pacifica. Garland Nixon has a show on Radio Sputnik and has 2 shows on Pacifica. But for some reason, Brad Friedman's not a Russian bot because his shows on Radio Sputnik don't count. I don't get it, but now you see why I'm calling a guy an idiot. At any rate, here's my point. And Brad Friedman was the perfect guy to point that out in the epistemological crisis. And here's where I'm going. If you have false beliefs about Russia or anybody else, you're going to make bad decisions, right? If you think that Garland's doing X for the money, then you're going to move forward based on something that's false, and your decisions will bear that out. So Garland's a guy. When did I first start studying, say, the Russian culture and the Russian ways? Early 2000s, I had a mentor. My mentor, Paul Robeson Jr., my political mentor, was a guy who went to school in Moscow. He went to school in the Soviet Union. He spoke fluent Russian, very much a world-renowned expert on Russia. He passed away. At one point, he was at the UN as a Russian interpreter, had a relationship with Sergei Lavrov. This was so before I even knew there was a Radio Sputnik, I was learning about Russian culture, Russian history, Russian this, Russian that. Then I got a job at Radio Sputnik, going to office all day. I'm around, some Russian people, learning the Russian culture, learning about Russia, blah, blah, blah. I find it interesting. I find Russian, maybe you call me a Russophile instead of a Russophobe. I find Russia interesting. You have some people who study Ray McGovern. You probably know Ray McGovern. He went to school. He got graduate degrees in Russian studies and Russian this and that. He found it interesting. You get some people that find something interesting and they study it. I find Russia, the Russian culture, everything about Russia interesting. And boom, I studied Russian history from a guy who went to school in Russia, whose father was beloved as a singer and a performer in Russia and loved Russia, right? Paul Robeson Sr. So I know and have a lot of respect and love for the Russian culture in Russia. Okay, that being said, I just found it very, very interesting and neat. But means I know something about it, right? I've studied it up close and personal. So here's my point. So what happens? I remember listening early when Russia came forward. But no, let me go back before then, when I knew something was fishy and these people were flipping idiots. 2016, when they started that Russian hack, Russian this and that stuff on, the Russiagate started. Knowing what I know about the Russian culture, they're like, okay, Russia's devious. And what they're trying to do is how they put it, they're trying to sow confusion and discord and all of these like amorphous things that like you can't even really find words to define, right? Knowing what I know about the Russians, that made no sense to me. 0 sense to me if you understand Russian culture. The Russians are very straightforward. They're very practical. The Russians are like this. If a Russian doesn't like you, he's going to tell you he doesn't like you. If a Russian's pissed at you, he might take a swipe at you or whatever. Russians are straightforward. That off-brand, we're going to cause disruption and confusion bull crap does not align with Russian culture. And I know there's people right now who are listening to this who are either Russian or have Russian friends or understand the Russian culture who know exactly what the hell I'm talking about. That ain't the way Russians do things. This fuzzy, emotional, sowing discord, amorphous kind of crap. No, they're very straightforward. When Sergei Lavrov, you know what, last December, a year ago, just within a few days, December 19th, the Russians delivered a list of security demands to the US, right? And they said, we want something in writing in return. That's very Russian right there. That's very Russian. We're going to write this stuff out in black and white. We're going to hand it to you, and we want something written in return. That's very Russian. This fuzzy, we're going to sow discord by doing some underhanded trick. That's CIA crap. That's very CIA-ish right there. That's CIA. That's CIA stuff. So what do you have? Projection. They projected onto the Russians something that it completely does not align with Russian culture. Russians are very practical, very straightforward, extremely cautious. You see a Russian guy walk crossing a one-way street, he's probably going to look both ways on a one-way street. Very, very cautious, very, very practical, right? Very, very straight and to the point. So when I watched Russiagate, I knew it was bullshit. I'm like, before I even started investigating and looking in it, I understand the Russian culture, and I knew that did not align with Russian culture. It's fuzzy, it's amorphous, it's CIA-ish. That ain't the way they do things. Not saying that Russian intelligence doesn't play games, but the idea that the Russians put up pictures of Buff Bernie going like this with like 5 different colors, and they like put tweets up about, hi, I'm LGBT and I might tell my mother. I wonder what she's going to say. And that's supposed to like change and somebody's supposed to look at that tweet and say, I think I'll write in Putin. I was going to vote for Hillary until I saw this tweet where somebody said they were LGBT and they couldn't figure out how to tell them. Literally, that was one of the tweets that was supposedly the Russians used to influence our election, right? Yes, that's it. So if you really think that the Russians are going to like do that, then you're an idiot and you'll never figure out what the Russians actually will do. They will do what the hell they tell you to do because they are very, very practical and straightforward and cautious and those kinds of things. That's the Russian culture. And the people who listen that I know that understand Russian culture know what the hell I'm talking about, right? Okay, so what happens? For any number of reasons, some financial, right? You've got these think tanks and you've got all of these people starting companies that based on Russiagate, they saw that they could make money. They're like, hey, wait a minute. We got people who are afraid of hacking. Let's come up with this company and we'll call it whatever. And we'll say we're a cybersecurity firm. Guess what? If you're selling umbrellas, you need to convince people it's going to rain. So the cybersecurity people had to go along with that. Yeah, the Russians, they're trying to fool us and sow discord and all this crap. Not only that, the government wanted to do a psyop because they wanted to shut down dissent. So if they said, well, the Russians are trying to sow discord by saying things that we don't want said, then any person who was a dissenter, such as you and I, that said it, we're spouting Russian talking points where it has to be shut down. So they had a very good excuse. It was bullshit, but it was a good excuse for shutting people down. So what happened? They fed off of it. And it's like the Russians are showing pictures of puppies. I remember literally this one idiot goes in front of Congress and argued that there was a Facebook page with pictures of puppies. And he's like, that's Russian. That's a classic Russian stuff right there. Let me tell you, they start with pictures of puppies. And what we believe is sooner or later, they transition away from pictures of puppies to political things. I don't know, maybe kittens, ferrets. I don't know. According to these idiots, I guess they must be some kind of small fuzzy animals that people are going to look at and go, my God, a picture of a baby ferret. I think I'll write in Putin's name. I vote for Putin. I don't know what the hell. It doesn't make sense. But if you're trying to start a think tank and you want to get funded by the government, if you're trying to start a cybersecurity company and you want to get funded by the government, it doesn't have to make sense because you're trying to eat. And if you just throw it out there, the Washington Post is going to put it up, the New York Times, well, you know, insider anonymous figures and from the intelligence say that the Russians are trying to sow discord by putting up pictures of baby ferrets, and everybody's eating, right? They're all getting paid. They're all getting some of that government slush fund. But it's bullshit. It's garbage. It is. So what we had was this. We had the NATO people, for all of their own internal reasons of making money and things like this, create an image, create a straw man of Russia that wasn't the real Russia, right? Let me say this. What it is this. Everything we use, words, sounds, pictures, letters, what are they? They're symbols. If I use the word tree, that ain't a tree. That's a sound. Tree. If it's French, arbre. right? A-R-B-R-E, right? If it's another Chinese, they got another word for tree, right? None of those things are a tree. Those are all sounds. And that sound is a symbol that represents that thing that I'm calling a tree, that the Chinese use another word. All of those sounds is to represent that thing over there. That oak tree that's sitting there, we use a sound. One of the problems we have in our society is people don't know the difference between the sound and the thing that it's pointing to. They think that the word tree is the same as that thing over there that the word tree is pointing at, is referring to. The word garland, right? Who are you? I'm Garland. No, I'm not. Garland is a sound. Garland is a symbol that represents me. That garland could also represent something that goes around, you hang on a Christmas tree, right? Judy Garland. So the sound garland is a symbol that refers to something. In one context, it refers to something that you hang on a Christmas tree. In another context, it refers to some dude that you're watching on Facebook. It's a word, and to be able to make reasonable decisions, you have to know the difference between the word and what it's referring to. You have to know the difference between the sign or symbol and what that sign or symbol is referring to. That sound, what is that referring to, right? So when you say Russia, what are you talking about? Here's what they did. NATO and these people, for their own internal reasons, a lot of them financial, fiduciary, right? I can get paid if I can convince everybody that Russia is thinking this way, but Russia doesn't think like that. The company, even when I say Russia, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the leadership of Russia. They also painted a picture of Russia as a country. Remember, it's being run by Vladimir Putin, and he is a singular dictator, and he is an evil singular dictator. And everybody in the country just does what he says because they're afraid they'll be immediately murdered. If Vladimir Putin says, everybody do a jumping jack, if anybody doesn't, then the FSB will come in and shoot him between the eyes. So they created a false narrative in which Putin is a dictator, in which Russia is a country that is run by a single evil dictator and nobody else would dare push against him. And they create this cartoonish version of Russia, a cartoonish version of Vladimir Putin. If you understand Vladimir Putin, the man's a lawyer, and he thinks very much like a lawyer. If you understand Vladimir Putin, the guy's a martial artist. He's got a black belt. Definitely thinks like a martial artist. If you think about Vladimir Putin, if you think about Russia in a logical perspective, and you say, okay, this is a guy, Vladimir Putin. I want to know about him. And how do you figure out who Vladimir Putin is? You are what your record says you are. You look at his background. He was a paper pusher. He was in the intelligence service. What did he do in the intelligence service? He was a lawyer in the intelligence service, and he advised people on legal issues in the intelligence service, right? If you look at his history, you can figure out what he's like now. But it didn't work for the NATO people, because they didn't want to know what Vladimir Putin was like, because they couldn't get paid off of that. They couldn't get power off of that. They couldn't rise up in this crooked empire by truly understanding who Vladimir Putin was or what's going on in Russia. They could do that by creating an image of Russia, a false image of Russia that their administrators, supervisors, and the people above them would be happy with. If they went in there and said, you know, guys, I think you're wrong about Putin, you're out of here, you're fired, you're out of the State Department. But if you go there and say, so you guys think Putin's a dictator? Yeah, well, then he's a dictator. He is. Let's talk about him being a dictator. If you looked at it and said, well, that doesn't make much sense. He's a dictator. He's got an 83% approval rating. How many that ain't dictator. If that's a dictator, then a lot of countries want a dictator. People want somebody with a does he have people around him? Does he gather people around him and make decisions as a unit? Or does he just do everything by himself and does not think, so they picture this, they give you this picture of this Hitler-esque dictatorial figure, which is false. And then they give you a picture of Russia, this country run by a dictator that's sitting around devious going, we will fool the evil Americans, and we will sow discord and discomfort, and we'll have them fighting with each other. That ain't the way Russians think. But they created that. And might I add, And I believe there's a certain level of racism towards the Slavic people here. They're a bunch of stupid knuckle dragging barbarians. Why these dumb Russians are just coming in with their guns, shooting at everything, killing every civilian and torturing people. Why? Because they're evil barbarians. Everybody knows the Slavs are a bunch of evil barbarians, right? So they create this racist view and image of Russians as morally and ethically inferior to the Europeans. And then what are they going in? Oh, they're just running into human waves, right? You've heard that the Russians are using human waves in Ukraine. What does that mean? That they're intellectually inferior. Why? They're not smart enough to actually sit down and plot and chart out a um, a military strategy. That they're not using like mathematics and technical means and powerful supercomputers to come up with a military campaign as would be done in this day and time. No, no, no. They're knuckle dragging apes. They're barbarians, and they're just dragging their rifles in, grunting to each other. Ugh, my name's Sergey. Ugh, my name. Ugh, and then they're just going like killing some civilians, right? Because they're intellectually, morally inferior to the Europeans. So they create this instance where they're just knuckle dragging thugs and apes because they're intellectually, morally inferior, right? Their culture's inferior to Europe. Everything's inferior. They're devious and evil. And they want to sow discord and all. So they create this straw man. They create this image of the Russians, right? And if they were fighting this image, they'd win. But they ain't, because they invented that image and it ain't real. So they're now, so if you understand what's going on with NATO and these lunatics in the EU, it's simple. They have created a straw man, a false image of Russia, a false image of the dynamics between themselves and Russia, and they're acting on those dynamics. Look, very early, what happened? The Russians did something that's very Russian. They wrote up a list of demands and they gave them to the US. And Jens Stoltenberg got a copy of them and they said, here's our security demands. We got to sit down and talk about this, right? Or else. And Jens Stoltenberg said, ho, ho, ho. Now, keep in mind, what is this based on? What does he say? The Russians don't have a say here. They don't have a sphere of influence. They don't have a veto here. Well, he was saying that based on the EU and NATO being superior to these inferior knuckle draggers, right? These mentally and intellectually inferior Russians, based on that. And of course, technologically inferior, because how could Russians come up? They're not as smart as the Europeans. How could they possibly come up with technology as good as the Europeans? Why, they've got common bows and arrows and spears, most likely, and maybe a few rocks that they've sharpened the edges of that they can try to scratch some catapults. They probably figured catapults. That's something you'd use if you're a Russian and you're technologically inferior to the Europeans. Catapults. That's probably what they saw. So when Jens Stoltenberg crossed his arm, the Russians have no say here. That was based on a weak, intellectually inferior Russia. Problem is Russia is neither weak nor intellectually inferior. Now, remember this? Russia's a gas station with nukes. That says that their military is inferior, right? And that their economy is tiny and minuscule. And they came up with, they using GDP, gross domestic product, which is created by Wall Street. It's a metric of standards created by Wall Street that are bullcrap. They said, yeah, the Russians have the 10th, 12th, 90th economy on Earth. It's absurd. There are other metrics and standards that could be used to measure an economy that, by some measures, it's twice the size of Germany. It's one of the biggest in the world. And like, look at what they're doing. How does Russia come up with the level of technology, with the military it has, with the power and economic power? How does it do all of that if they're just a bunch of knuckle-dragged apes who've got an economy? They're selling a few trinkets on the side of the road to make a dime. Doesn't make sense, does it? They got space stations. They've got, but no, they're just poor. They've got hypersonic missiles that we don't have. They've got all kinds of stuff, but somehow they're intellectually inferior. They created this because it worked for them inside their camp, and they all believed it, and they all made decisions based on that. So what happens? Well, Russia's intellectually, economically inferior, right? So what's going to happen? This war starts, we're going to sanction the hell out of them. Why? Because in our twisted minds, in our reality, the image of Russia that we created is very, very poor, and it's a gas station with nukes. If it were a gas station with nukes, the sanctions would have took it out. The problem is, it was a false image. It wasn't a gas station with nukes. It was a country that had spent a lot of years being very, very smart. They had spent a lot of years preparing for an attack on the West, which they get from the West, which they keep getting in an asymmetric, all manners of attacks coming. In doing that, they set up the things that they needed. They set up channels for the things they needed. They created diplomatic relationships with other countries so they could sell other stuff no matter what happened. So they set themselves up for this. And when it happened, when the NATO and the EU said, we got you now, we got just what we want, and we're going to move forward now and sanction you out of business, they were set. And they said, okay, go ahead and give it a shot. And boom, they were actually surprised at how well prepared they were. And they went out, and then the U.S. empire was like, ha, ha, ha. And we've got an image of the rest of the world, and that is they'll do what the hell we tell us that we tell them to do. And why was that? Because they threatened people, and a lot of times people did. But when all of these other countries in the global South, when the African countries and the Latin America countries, they looked at them and they said, you sons of bitches, you've been robbing us blind and treating us like crap for the last 500 years. The Chinese haven't been doing that. The Russians haven't been doing that. No, we ain't down with that. We're going to chill with the Russians and the Chinese. The Indians were like, oh, really? You want us to side with the British? Yeah, you need to read a couple history books. Not happening. So they had a false and absurd image of their influence over what they would call, we call now the developing countries, what they used to call the third world, but these are developing and rising countries. Russia and China had created diplomatic relationships with these countries where they treated them as equals. They treated them as this is your country, this is your culture. You people have some differences. We're proud of our differences. You're proud of your differences. Like, let's all make money. We all got to eat. And so the other countries looked at it and said, we're down with Russia and China. They're better than you bastards. You always overthrow us and kill our leaders. So what happened? NATO and the EU had a false image of their relationships with the other countries. They had a false image of what their adversary was. They were going against Russia. What is the number one rule of conflict? If you're training in martial arts, if you're training in boxing, if you're training in self-defense, number one rule of conflict: never underestimate your adversary. Overestimate your adversary, you're much better off. You're fine if you think your adversary is stronger than it is, because that's your best move. But never underestimate your adversary, because you might get a big surprise. And what did these idiots do? They underestimated Russia. They underestimated Russia's ability to build diplomatic and economic coalitions around the world. They overestimated their economic power and their ability to affect Russia, because they had an image of Russia as a bunch of idiot, knuckle-dragging Slavs who weren't smart enough to understand anything, and of course, a gas station with nukes. And so, like, we're going to cut off their energy sales. When we cut their energy sales off, they're done. And so, what did they do? They made energy more scarce. Let's talk about a market. You make a commodity more scarce, and the value of it increases. So they went after Russia's commodities. Russia's commodities got more expensive, and Russia's selling less and making more. That was predictable, but not if you're a flipping idiot. You're not going to do that, because you have a false image of Russia, and you're going to sanction them, and they're going to drop. And they didn't. And now they don't know what to do, because now, why is it that NATO and the U.S. empire is so frozen? What are they saying now? Well, we got a 7th pack of sanctions. Well, an eighth package of sanctions, 9th package of sanctions. All they know how to do is another. There'll be a 10th, 11th, the 12th, the 13th. All they know how to do is do another package of sanctions. Why? Because this one didn't work. They don't understand it. It's the old, I'm going to yell at you. You better do what I say, and you don't do it. Well, I must not have been yelling loud enough, because the only thing I know how to do is yell. So I'll yell louder. Well, it still didn't work. And I'll yell louder, and I'll yell louder, because the only thing I know how to do is yell. And when I don't get what I want, I just keep yelling louder and louder and louder and louder. It never dawns on me that yelling ain't working, that I need to try something else, right? That vinegar's not working, I need to go to honey. That ain't going to dawn on me. That's where they are. It's not going to dawn on them. Well, the sanctions aren't working, and the sanctions are hurting us really, really bad. They can't stop the thing. They got to think like this. We know Russia is economically and intellectually inferior to us. And we know that everything we believe has to be true. Therefore, if it's not working, it can only be because we're not doing enough of it. It can only be because we need to continue to do more of what we're doing. Because when I use the word Russia, what I am referring to as best I can is something that I have understood based on my observation and study of this particular country, this culture, and its people, right? I use the word Russia. I'm referring to, use the word Vladimir Putin. I've studied from a non-biased perspective. I don't want to think he's a great guy or he's a bad guy or anything in between. I want to know, what's his history? What has he done? What has his country happened under him? What's going on around him? I want to try to figure out what he is, right? If you're putting a puzzle together, you can't take a piece out and just shove it wherever you want it to go. There's a place that puzzle piece goes. And if you want to know Vladimir Putin, try to figure out what he's done, where he comes from, what decisions he's made, listen to his speeches, things of that nature, and you can understand it. Whereas these idiots, they'll listen to a Vladimir Putin speech, which will never align with what they believe about Vladimir Putin. And they'll say, aha, he's slicker than we thought. He's trying to fool us with this speech. Why? Because they can't admit that that speech is who Vladimir Putin really is, and that he's talking from the heart. He's saying what he believes. They can't admit that, ever, because it doesn't work for what they believe in. So what do they keep doing? They keep running afoul of the truth. They're going in the wrong direction. And all they can do is keep going in the wrong direction. Because when I say Russia, I try to have a realistic understanding of what that term Russia is referring to. The people, the culture, the background, the history, the leadership. I would have put all that together and have an understanding of that blob. When these neocons, when the NATO people, etc., say Russia, they're referring to a fictional country. When they say Vladimir Putin, a fictional leader that they have created in their mind. Joe Biden, you got people saying Joe Biden is the left. Joe Biden's the left, right? So now in America, perfect example, people, the left, and I'm not going to get deep into this, but the left, pro-organized labor, anti-corporate, anti-war, suspicious of what's the term I want to use? Centralized power. There's some things that are traditionally the left. Joe Biden hates all of that stuff. He hates socialists, despises them worse than the conservatives. He's pro-corporate, he's pro-war, all of the things that the traditional left hates. Loves, Joe Biden hates. But he and the neoliberals have redefined the term left. Left was about economic class. They have redefined it. So now left, when somebody says he's the left, what does that mean? Oh, he's for the trans bathroom agenda or something. Now they've redefined it to a bunch of cultural issues that are completely unrelated to the traditional left. So you see socialists, go to South America. The socialists in South America, they're very Catholic, right? They tend to have no abortions. They tend to not like marijuana legalization, things of that nature, right? You go to South America, and the left, the socialists, are culturally conservative. Why? Because to them, leftiness, socialism, is about economic class. That's how they see. That's traditional left. It's about economic class. I'm a guy who spent some time in South America. I can tell you, they can be very conservative socially, but economic class, that's their focus, right? Whereas the so-called left of Joe Biden is just neoliberal, right-wing, not even conservative, neoliberal economics, globalist neoliberal, their own brand of economics, a very fascist brand of economics. And they call themselves left just because the LGBTQ, and they claim human rights. That's all a lie, and things of that nature. And they claim to be standing up for Black Lives Matter. There's all lies, 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 lies. They just use those words so they can claim to be on the left and hide who they really are, which is neoliberal fascists. They're ultra liberal fascists. And they want to hide it by claiming they're on the left, by redefining left to mean cultural issues rather than economic class. Again, when you say the left, what are you referring to? If you're referring to Joe Biden, a bunch of fascist neoliberals because of the LGBTQ fake Black Lives Matter stuff that has nothing to do with actually helping Black people or gay people, it has to do with pretending to. It has to be with fraudulently coming up with, these claims that a lot of people oftentimes are like, I don't know what the hell they're talking about, right? So to get back to the Russia thing, because this is what it's all about. This is what this discussion is all about. When you use the word Russia, what are you talking to? When you use the word left, what are you talking about? And why are the decisions of the leaders of NATO, which is the US empire, so bizarre, so absurd, so preposterous? Because they're making them based on an image of Russia that they've created that is completely runs contrary to the reality of the country that is Russia, of the culture that is Russia, of the present government that it is Russia, of the leadership of Russia. So what they believe in is nothing to do with Russia. So they could never make a decision that would be related to the Russia of today. So what happens? Russia's winning, they got to say Russia's losing, and then they got to make a decision based on that. Russia's losing, they're being, oh my God, they're being overrun by the Ukrainians. Now they're going to make a decision based on the fact that Russians are being overrun by the Ukrainians, but they aren't. So it's going to be a bad decision. And PR, yes, we're going to give them whatever the latest wonder weapon is, right? M777s, HIMARS, something or other. We're going to give them this new war toy, and they're going to use that to defeat the Russians. But they're not. The problem is, in this magical world that they've created about war and about Russia, it's going to work. All you got to do is give them a new toy, and they'll use it to defeat the Russians. In the reality of war, it's very complicated. And people use integrated systems. They don't just take one thing and use it. They don't take one HIMARS, one M777, one Patriot missile battery and win. Modern warfare is about integrated systems. And using these integrated systems, integrating your space-based systems with your land-based systems, with your networked anti-aircraft and aerial surveillance equipment. All of these things are very, very complicated. But if you think the Russians are a bunch of idiots and knuckle-dragging apes, then you're not going to think they're smart enough to do that. And if you think that the people that you serve, that you've not served, but that elected you, not even elected you, but you get my point, that you're in office ruling over, if you think they're idiots, then you can tell them anything too to make money. A lot of this is money laundering, but what you do is you create this false image of Russia, and then you project that out onto your population. So when you make these preposterous decisions, your population says, yeah, that's the right decision based on what I've been told about Russia. I don't know how many times I've had people say things to me, and I'm like, well, that's preposterous, and I'll give them some evidence. Well, what about this? And they'll go, and they just look at you. Yeah, well, Russia did this, and I'm like, well, I remember I had a guy say to me, it was like a missile hit some area or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, the Ukrainians did that. He's like, no. I'm like, it's a Ukrainian actually area they hit. It's not a Russian area. He's like, oh, yeah. I'm like, Donbass, that area is actually at that time, I'm like, it's actually in Ukraine. They're Russian speaking stuff. And he's like, well, why would the Ukrainians kill their own people? And I'm like, well, this war started in 2014 and they've killed 16,000 of their own people before this war even started. And he looked at me like, and the look was, that runs afoul of everything I believe and everything I've been told. I don't know what to make of it. He just looked at me like, I don't know what to make of this. Holy shit. And then he just went on about his business. He just like, this is too complicated. I'm going to have to ask some more questions. I'm going to have to understand some more things. And I don't want to do that because then I'm going to be a dissenter like you, Garland, if I know too much. I'd rather just believe what I'm told and believe that the Ukrainians are winning and the Russians are losing and move forward. The problem is, at some point, the fake Russia, the this dreamed up concept of Russia that they're operating with is going to run headlong into the real thing. Kind of like, was it a I think there was a Star Trek one time, and there was like an alternate universe, and there was like a Spock and Captain Kirk or something. There's been a lot of sci-fi things that have done this, right? And at some point they meet their self from the other. Well, I mean, sometimes they'll be evil and this one's good, or at other times they'll meet themselves from the future, or they'll meet themselves from, an alternate universe or something like that. Well, that's the destiny here. At some point, the real Russia, which is quite competent in military adventures, has a long history of winning military adventures. One of the reasons is because they're patient and they're practical, and that kind of works in military adventures. So at some point, this fake Russia that couldn't possibly beat Ukraine, it's boneheaded and stupid, that's broke and poor and all these things, and intellectually and morally bankrupt, is going to run headlong into this fake concept of Russia that they had. And they're going to be sitting there saying, oh shit, the Russians won. But in our universe, the Russians couldn't win because they're not smart enough and well equipped enough to win. But they did. How do we do that? It's going to be like there was this famous Star Trek episode where there was some like these robots, androids, and they said, to screw this android up, Captain Kirk said, okay, everything that Mr. Spock says is a lie. And the android says, okay. And Mr. Spock looked at him and said, I am lying. And the android says, wait a minute. Okay, everything you said is a lie. But if you're lying, that would mean that you're telling the truth. But you can't tell the truth because everything you said is a lie. So it has to be a lie, but it can't be because you said you were lying. So that can't be true. And then in a couple seconds, the android's head just went blah, and smoke came out of his ears. And that's what happens. At some point, for the NATO and the US empire, it's blah, and smoke comes out of their ears. At some point, it's going to be like, okay, the Russians couldn't possibly win. Oh, shit. Did you hear what's happening in Ukraine? The Ukrainians are running for their lives. Right now, Ukraine's collapsing. The Russians aren't smart enough to do that. Why? They're intellectually inferior. They can't plot this thing out. They're moving slow, buddy. Real slow right now. They're turning off the gas. They're turning off the electricity. They're taking their time. They're plotting and they're moving slow. And that's going to work. That is going to work. And at some point, this Ukraine project is going to collapse. See, one of the things I think the NATO won't, and I've said this all along, if the Ukrainian troops are on the run or whatever, NATO won't step in, and they don't have the manpower, the military power to do it anyway. Right now, they're being demilitarized, but they could consider it. When Ukraine collapses, how are you going to help prop up something that's collapsed? There's going to be nothing for them to prop up. There's going to be nothing for them to jump in and help. So the Russians, in turning off their electricity, they're yanking the foundation out from under this country. They're pulling the foundation. The military yanking it to pieces bit by bit. The infrastructure, electric infrastructure, etc. They're just pulling the foundation out. And when you pull the foundation out from under something, it's like legs. You do a takedown, right? I take your legs out from under you. You're going down to the ground. And there ain't nothing to help. There's nothing so when the foundation of Ukraine is dismantled completely by Russia, which is what they're doing slowly but surely. I'm not saying they're not going to do an offensive. They might do an offensive, but they're pulling the foundation of Ukraine apart. There will be an economic, military, and political collapse, and there ain't going to be nothing to fix. And let me tell you this: these stupid old Russians, those Ukrainian crazies. I'm not saying all Ukrainian people are crazy. There are going to be a lot of, sadly and unfortunately, a lot of men, women, and children that are just escaping the fighting, that are victims of U.S. imperialism, right? They're going to be heading west, young man. They'll head west. Go west, young man, as the old movies used to say. They're going to be heading into Europe. And the Europeans are going to have literally millions of these people, and they're going to be in trouble because they have said to their population, these idiot Russians, watch this, we're going to make them fall. You're going to have to suffer, but don't worry about it. We got to do this to make the Russians fall. They're going to be suffering. The Russians ain't going to fall, and they're going to have Ukrainian refugees running around like mice. How are they going to explain that when the real Russia comes face to face, or excuse me, when their false concept of what Russia is comes face to face with the reality that is Russia? How are they going to explain that to their population, sitting there saying we're freezing? The United States has stolen all our industry. They're all Siemens, all of them, they're gone. And we don't have any jobs. We don't have anything. And Russia's just powerful, more power. Russia's doing great, and we're screwed. And you told us you were going to destroy Russia, that Russia was a bunch of idiots. And all they'll have is the concept of Russia and some blue and yellow flags. So I think that's it. I just wanted to chat a bit. My God, I can't believe I've been on here for 50 minutes. Thanks a lot, everybody. I will say the usual before I leave. Any super chats? Come on. We got some super chats. And Sparky says, West leaders are poster children for smugglers. You're right. There's some stupid mess. Staticrest says, busy with 3 little kids, but learned so much listening to you. Baby Gerald says, I'd love to see a long-form conversation between you and Professor Michael Hudson. Please give us this meeting of great minds. We need this. I love Michael Hudson. He's got a great article out now. Ms. says, Berlin is the something of the West. Every time I want the West to screams, I squeeze on Berlin. Okay. How about this? Sparky says, because of the West's false image of Russia, they paid no attention to all Russia's well-publicized economic contingencies, much less any secret ones. Exactly. Because that couldn't be. Russia's not smart enough to do that. Get out of here. They're a bunch of idiots. They're not smart enough to do those things, Sparky, in their twisted mind. Let's go to Rockfin. Nobody on Rockfin is giving me any tips, but that's okay. That's fine. I only ask people to do what they can do. So, a couple of things. Please go to my Rockfin channel, rockfin.com/Garland Nixon, and sign up, become a member. It doesn't cost anything to become a member. And in the event, maybe the likely event that they throw me off YouTube, you can find me on Rockfin. You see everything scrolling across the bottom, PayPal, buymeacoffee.com/Garland in with an H, Cash App, that's all there. If you can do Patreon, $1, $3, $5, $100 a month, whatever you can afford, no more than you can afford. And last but not least, don't forget Rockfin is free. Everybody can join Rockfin, no cost whatsoever. However, you can become a subscriber if you want. I think I'm not sure. It's somewhere between $9.99 and $14.99 a month. I got to send them an email and find out. But at any rate, and if you sign for a year, you get 2 free months. That's the bottom line. But at any rate, so I need to do the exact amount and figure out what it is. Sorry about that. I'll find it out. But Rockfin is a free speech platform. They ain't kicking me off. I can say whatever I want. There's a lot of great shows on Rockfin. Please join Rockfin, ROKFIN.com/Garland Nixon. Go to Rockfin, browse all the great shows. All the creators on Rockfin, we all do 1 premium show per month. This is to help keep the platform going. Rockfin doesn't show any ads, and it does not. It lets us say whatever the hell we want. They ain't worried about it, right? But in order to keep stay in business, they do subscribers. So if you can afford to be a subscriber, a monthly subscriber, just go to my channel and become a monthly subscriber. The one thing you will get from it is my 1 premium show per week, which is Scott Ritter from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time every Friday. That's what I do. My premium members get. But there's a lot of premium shows that every channel does premium shows. Check out all the other channels. Great stuff. Everybody's on there too. Caleb Maupin's on there. Jimmy Dore's on there. The Duran is on there. Go to all of them. Sign up for all of their, become members of all of Duran, all of those, because any of us could be kicked off of YouTube at any time. So go to Rockfin. Make sure you're a member on Rockfin too, just in case we get kicked off of YouTube. Any of us can and will. Slow News Day, that's a great show. Guess what? YouTube just closed their channel down, but they're on Rockfin, so you can check out Slow News Day. I guess they probably hated some stuff they said about COVID or something. Whatever. At any rate, thanks a lot, everybody. I'm out.